Thousands of people are being evacuated downstream of a major dam which has collapsed in Russia-held Ukraine. President Volodymyr Zelensky said 80 towns and villages may be flooded after the destruction of the dam at Nova Kakhovka, which he blamed on Russia. Water is surging down the Dnipro River and said to pose a catastrophic flooding risk to the city of Cookson. Russia has denied destroying the dam, which it controls, instead blaming Ukrainian shelling. Arise News chief correspondent John Cookson has the story.
Evacuations and rescue operations in southern Ukraine continue after the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam sent a torrent of water rushing through dozens of towns along the war zone's southern front line. It wasn't only people who needed rescue. Ukrainian officials said about 42,000 people on both sides of the Dnipro River, which divides government-controlled and Russian-occupied territory, were affected by the catastrophe. Overnight, the waters reached critical levels in several settlements, completely submerging Cookson and Oleshki. Authorities announced a state of emergency across the Russian-held territories. Ukraine's President Zelensky has accused Russia of blowing up the dam. In his nightly address, he said, "The whole world will know about this Russian war crime. This deliberate destruction of the dam and other facilities by the Russian occupiers is an environmental bomb of mass destruction," he said. Around 5 billion gallons of water were released when the dam collapsed yesterday. Ukraine claims Russia attacked it with a rocket or explosives. The Russians are accusing the Ukrainians of the same. US officials have come to no conclusion yet.
We've seen the reports that Russia was responsible for the explosion at the dam, which I would remind Russian forces took over illegally last year and have been occupying since then. We're doing the best we can to assess those reports, and we are working with the Ukrainians to gather more information. But we cannot say conclusively what happened at this point.
In the UN Security Council, Russian Ambassador Vasily Nebenza accused the Ukrainians of blowing up the dam for military advantage without giving further details. For families in the flooded region caught in a war zone and now losing their homes in a man-made deluge, they're just grateful for rescue. Waters are expected to subside in the next few days. Only then will we know the scale of the disaster. John Cookson, Arise News.
And now John Cookson, our Arise chief correspondent, joins us from London for more. Hello, John. Now, this is a developing story, so please tell us what impact the floods are having.
Well, appalling scenes from the area. The devastation is just unbelievable. And those poor people, I mean, they've been in a war zone for months and, from time to time, their homes are shelled. And now suddenly you have this massive deluge just ripping away at the landscape and flooding homes, and there are a lot of animals missing. It's a farming territory. I heard a report that 300 zoo animals have died, and we're yet to hear what the human cost is so far in terms of casualties. The Russians suggesting 9 people missing, but we'll have to wait and see. A lot of people spent the night on roofs in the area or in trees even. There's no drinking water, no electricity for some of these people. It's really a dire scene there in that part of the world for people families who've suffered so much over recent months.
Well, John, the war of words is still going on as to which side in the conflict was responsible. What more do we know about this today?
Well, the dam was built in 1956. It's 3 kilometers long, about 30 meters tall. It was in a bad state of repair, and it could conceivably have collapsed on its own. That's one theory. However, the Ukrainians are blaming the Russians are blaming the Ukrainians. The Americans, in my report, you heard there, haven't made their minds up yet, but they know. I mean, the US have spy satellites tracking the area all the time, and I think the Americans have a good idea, although they're not saying at the present time. The Russians say that the Ukrainians did it to flood Russian fortifications in the region, and the Ukrainians say the Russians did it to thwart their attempts to cross, because the dam is not only a dam, it's a bridge across the Dnipro River. And that was one access point that the Ukrainians would have should this big offensive really get underway, to get to the Russian-occupied territories that they want to liberate. So that's the argument being put forward by the Ukrainians. Will we ever know? I'm not sure We'll find out who was responsible. Rather like the pipelines that were blown up in the Baltic Sea last year, we never got to the bottom of that. Will we ever know who blew the dam? I'm not sure, but the Ukrainians are convinced it was the Russians.
Okay, John, so is the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant still safe from the meltdown?
According to reports, yes, it still is. Just to remind viewers, the Zaporizhzhia plant is about 200 kilometers upstream and relies on water to cool down spent nuclear fuel rods that are kept in huge lagoons there. Now, if that water supply runs out, or indeed if electricity is cut off to keep the cooling system going, then there could, in theory, be a nuclear meltdown, releasing millions of tons of radioactive material into the atmosphere. That will be a complete disaster, of course. And this plant is sitting in a war zone. It's shelled from time to time by both sides, both the Russians and the Ukrainians. It's in Russian-controlled territory at the moment, but manned by Ukrainian officials. So it seems that the plant is okay for the time being. Long term, we don't know what the water levels are going to be like in the future. Now this dam has been removed. It will take years to rebuild a dam. So the implications for communities and installations like the nuclear plant upstream are very uncertain at the moment.
Well, John, the Ukrainians are accusing the Russians of planning to blow the plant up. What's the likelihood that that's the case?
Well, the background to a lot of this is that the Ukrainians believe, and have believed for decades now, that Russia wants to wipe Ukraine off the face of the earth. And they point to the fact that Joe Stalin, who ruled Russia during the 1930s, in fact, imposed a famine on Ukraine by depriving them of vital grains and wheat that they needed. And 3 million Ukrainians died during that period. And since then, the Ukrainians have been convinced that Russia wants to wipe Ukraine off the map. And in modern times, we've had the destruction of Mariupol and other cities. And this fits the narrative that the Ukrainians believe that by bombing a nuclear plant, it will have an effect of wiping out a large section of the population in that area. I doubt that's going to happen. And the reason why I say that is because the nuclear cloud will drift into Russian territory. So why would the Russians do that? Why would they deliberately blow up a nuclear power station, knowing the impact that it would have on the Russian people in that part of the world? So although the Ukrainians might say that they believe the Russians are going to do this, I might be totally wrong, but and I hope I'm right, that the Russians would never do that.
I hope you're right too, John. But when we look at what was told to the United Nations about this unfortunate situation, saying that the magnitude of this catastrophe will only become clear in coming days, and also a report from Reuters is saying that there's warning of floating mines and disease as a result of this. Can you touch on that, please?
Yes, it was thought initially that the peak flooding would come today or within 72 hours, and we're actually in that period now. And yes, the waters have dislodged landmines that were laid. I mean, it is a war zone, and both sides have put mines down, and they've become dislodged. So, and they've been floating away downstream, and God forbid that a kid finds one on a bit of exposed land and stands on it or pokes it. the ramifications of floating landmines arriving in farmland is just awful to contemplate. So the UN says that we won't know the full extent until the waters start to recede, and that's not going to happen for a few days yet. But the impact on the land and the effect on the grain harvest, I was there only a couple of weeks ago, not in that region, but in the north, and the wheat is starting to come through now for summer. A lot of that will have just been washed away in this horrible deluge that struck the region yesterday.
Thank you so much, RI's Chief Correspondent John Cookson.